So now we're joined by Jane Naismith, who is Joint CEO here at St Joseph's Hospice. And Jane, I'd like to start with a few of those nuts and bolts questions. So first of all, what is a hospice and what does it do?
So I think people often think of a hospice as just a building, and a hospice is far more than just a building. A hospice is more a philosophy of care, and it's more about meeting people wherever they need hospice care. So that could be our community nurses going into their own home, it could be in our day hospice, it could be in our inpatient unit, it could be somebody having a complementary therapy or a counselling session. So it is much more than just its entire physical building, its physical form. And it's all about supporting people with life-limiting illnesses who aren't necessarily imminently dying, and a lot of people expect hospice care just to be about dying. And in fact, I would probably argue it's absolutely opposite. It's about living until you die, but it's about supporting people to live really well until they die. And that often means that people will touch a hospice at several points because it's a continuum. So they might meet one of our community nurses or come to day hospice for a short period, and then symptoms might be improved and they might be discharged, and then their symptoms might come back or change, might be seen again, may come into our inpatient unit for a short period of time, may come home, and so on and so forth. So it's not just one building, it's a philosophy.
And so when, one might have that misconception that, if I'm going to a hospice, I'm going to die. That's not always the case, is it?
I would probably say it's very rarely the case unless it's really your preference to be cared for at the end of your life in a hospice. And when I say that, I mean the last few days, maybe weeks. So hospices used to be places where people would kind of be tucked up in bed for 6 months or 3 months. Now, very much our inpatient unit, the average length of stay is about 15 days, and very much more around supporting people to feel better, to maximise the time they have, and then to go and be with who they wish to be with, which generally isn't a group of nurses in an inpatient unit.
Do you think most, you can tell me, people nearing the end of their life actually want to know what's going to happen to them?
I think if I look at my clinical practice, because I'm a specialist palliative care nurse and I've been doing it for the last 20 odd years, I think about 50-50. A lot of people really want detailed information and feel very cheated that you can't kind of give them very detailed information like, on Tuesday afternoon this is going to happen. And then other people are very much, I don't really want to know, and what happens will happen to me, and please don't tell me because it's scary. So often families want to know though, because families find the thought of someone dying or getting less well, one, it's incredibly emotionally difficult, but it's also really scary, and they're frightened of doing the wrong thing. So families often want to know. But I suppose my experience tells me that people die as they live. So if you're the sort of person who wants to know lots, then you're likely to want to know lots when you've got a life-limiting illness. And you're likely to want to ask questions and find out more and try and make sense of it. Whereas if you're the sort of person who's a bit more laissez-faire and just tell me what I need to know and don't ask me to make too many decisions, then that tends to be how you are as well. So it really is about personality type.
And tell me about the services then. I mean, you mentioned the day hospice. We were fortunate enough to go in and see the wonderful work in there. That's very uplifting. Mm-hmm. Life seems to be a word I hear more than death actually in this place, if I'm going to be totally honest. Yes. So tell me a bit about the services that are offered.
So I think the first thing to say is that a hospice or specialist palliative care, because we're a specialist palliative care unit, is designed for people with symptoms which are more complex than their normal care services can look after. So be that their GP, district nurse, hospital specialist at hospital, i.e. the nurse who supports them, not the oncologist or heart failure, heart cardiologist. So they're for people with more complexity. So the idea is that their local care team have tried to do things, maybe help them with pain or whatever that might be, and it's not been as successful, so they're referred to us. So we've got a whole range of services, because the best way to think about it is that for any of us, and I'm going to use something really, really simple, you've got a pain, you've got back pain, let's say, but that back pain doesn't just affect you physically, it affects you psychologically, it affects you socially, it affects you spiritually. And it's not just the case of giving you a painkiller. Sometimes talking about it, sometimes having some physiotherapy, sometimes having distraction, sometimes actually having some medication or seeing a specialist doctor to have some, injections or something might make the difference. So the services are very like that. So we've got our inpatient unit, our day services, counsellors, got social workers. A lot of people have issues around housing or worried about, especially if you've got younger children, about the future and about who's going to look after them. Benefits advice, because being ill costs money and people often end up losing their income or having their income curtailed. Support for carers, chaplaincy, spiritual care, and a whole range of psychological things.
And we were talking to your co-joint CEO, Tony, about some of the sort of, the financial side that you can't get away from. It all costs money, of course. But one thing we didn't talk about that I'd like to ask you about, that wonderful network of volunteers. I mean, over 500 I read. I mean, that's quite something. So yes, there's a natural financial side to this, but there are many wonderful people that give of their time to this special place, aren't there?
And a lot of our volunteers actually do direct patient things. So they're not all people in charity shops or, fundraising or whatever. We've got 5 services here that we call volunteer delivered, and they've got paid members of staff who train the volunteers, assess the people who need that service, and then the volunteers go out and deliver it. So I talked about our benefits advice, and that's a really good example of that. So we've got one paid benefits worker, but we've got an army of volunteers. I think right now it's about 20 something, but around about 20. Who actually provide the direct support and help people with the forms and help people with the nuts and bolts. Because if we just had paid staff, we'd never be able to meet the needs. So these amazing volunteers that are bereavement volunteers who provide counselling, they're often people who have already trained in counselling but are doing further training and need some practice hours, or they did some practice hours with us and have come back to volunteer. So they provide counselling for our bereavement counsellors. So we've got a huge army of volunteers, and I think every hospice would be the same. Without its volunteers, it wouldn't be able to offer what it does.
Yeah, it clearly extends the services. But what I also like is that I've heard from various quarters, and we've spoken to a lot of people today, that the volunteers often will be family members or have a connection with those that have been here receiving the services, which is a wonderful building upon and giving a bit back, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think that's something about human nature. We want to give something back. But also I think maybe for a lot of our volunteers, they've walked that path themselves and know how hard it is, and therefore feel very drawn to support people in a similar situation to themselves or going through similar things. But also I think it's maybe one thing I think hospices are very good at is treating everybody as an individual. And I think they will experience that individuality when their loved one was going through and having our services. But even as volunteers, it's about being an individual. So we're very good at working with people's strengths and supporting people to be able to give in a way they can, because not all of us can do the same things.
Now, what I also like about this place, and forgive me, I hope there's not too much ignorance in here, but it doesn't feel clinical. It feels very caring. And it also, one could be forgiven if you're in a hospital, for instance, of seeing it in quite a linear fashion. Someone gets ill, someone is at the end of their life, they die, you move on. And there's always going to be that circle. But here it feels that there's a little bit more than that. So if, for instance, a bereaved family member came after the event and said, look, I want to give a bit back, or wanted to talk a bit more, it seems to me that there are aspects of St Joseph's that accommodate people. It's not so much this is it ends here. It's wider than that, isn't it?
So I suppose, first of all, we're a hospice in a community, and we are part of our community. And our hub's a really good example of that. You could pop in and have a cup of coffee. And, that's really important to us, because if somebody pops in to have a cup of coffee, then they realise that hospices aren't scary places. So partly we're part of the community, and we also, you get to know people. It's quite an intimate thing, a hugely privileged intimate thing, caring for somebody at the end of their life. So you get to know them and their families, and therefore families do tend to come back. And sometimes we signpost them to other services, but generally services that we can provide and support them to kind of move on from our support to, because there's nothing worse, you're right, hospital is linear. I've seen so many people leave hospital with a little property bag of their loved one's belongings and nothing else. And that's not how it should be. It should be more of a continuation process, which naturally tapers off, or they come back as volunteers.
I love what you say about community there. What would you say the future is for the hospice movement, the future of this particular hospice? Is it going in the right direction? Is it a place that you're content with, or can there always be more that can be done?
You can never be content. There's always more. I think here we have to be mindful that our population is changing. The population of our core boroughs are changing, they're becoming younger. And therefore that probably certainly will mean we'll be offering far more services to the community. Maybe more drop-in services rather than fixed appointment services, if that makes sense. How you flex to do that's a challenge, because you don't want everybody dropping in at 4 o'clock and wanting something. But I believe probably if I came back here in 30 years, there might be less beds, but our community team would probably be 3 times the size, and so would all our other support services, our day hospice, etc., etc., etc. Because I think less people will come in and more, or people will still want to be in a hospice and still want to be in a hospice bed, but for shorter periods of time.
Now, am I going to be too idealistic here? But it sounds to me that there needs to be a sort of shared humanity then, really. You know, it literally extending the community. Yes, this is bricks and mortar with some wonderful people and services within it, but is part of a better future all of us realising we all have a particular part to play?
So absolutely, and that's our compassionate neighbours scheme is a prime example of that, and we very much see that as maybe being a social movement in time where it's about being prepared to support each other. But I do think you probably need to have a bit of training to do that. And that's for our compassionate neighbours. So our compassionate neighbours are volunteers who do a 4-day training programme, and then they're matched with someone who maybe has a life-limiting illness, who's quite isolated. And rather than me coming and saying, well, can I do your garden today, or what can I do for you? Because nobody likes to be done for. It's very much what can we do together? And how do we, because actually most things you do, you get something back from. That's why we're successful as volunteers. You get something out of volunteering. So it's what can we do together? What's our shared commonality? And I do think it is about being human and about humanity. And you're right, that's not idealistic. How we achieve it, though, is hard.
Very, very much so. So the final question, and this was sort of my final question to Tony and others actually. If you had somebody in front of you that was sceptical about the hospice movement, about what happens here at St Joseph's, in a nutshell, what would you say to them to encourage them to open their eyes to what happens here?
Trust us and come have a chat. And I think that would be it. Trust us and step in the door and just come for a chat.
So the proof's in the pudding, come and see.
Come and see. You don't need to come as a patient. Just come and say, can I have a look round? Can I meet someone?
Good invitation. Jane, thank you very much indeed.